That was the time-honoured way of starting a session, is to close the door. Welcome everyone. Welcome here to the University of Strathclyde, particularly to the Technology and Innovation Centre here. My name is David Wilson. I'm Executive Director of the International Public Policy Institute here at Strathclyde University. I'm delighted to be welcoming you and introducing the first half of this afternoon's session. Now, I really want to start with two things. First is, I think I feel slightly ill-placed to make this introduction because this is really Francesco's event, and I think he has been the driving force behind setting all this up and taking forward the work, particularly supporting and as Programme Director of the Master of Laws in Climate Change Law and Policy here at Strathclyde. So take it in the usual way. Everything good about this afternoon, I think, will come down to Francesco and the fantastic group of speakers that we have during the course of the afternoon. Anything not so good, then clearly you blame the person that starts off or that chairs to go forward. Now, I'm looking forward to, I think, a fascinating afternoon, talking us through what actually happened at the Paris climate change negotiations, and what that means going forward in terms of just the sense around implementation, the challenges that will involve now that we appear to have a binding legal framework for taking forward climate change across the world. Now, there's a lot of issues in all of that, and we'll try and take through each of them, and I think, well, certainly hope you'll find it a useful and interesting session. But just before we get into that, I've got a few introductory remarks, some more serious than others. But the first is a welcome to Glasgow, particularly to the international guests and visitors that we have here today. I mean, some of you that maybe were here this morning, you would have seen Glasgow at its best. I don't know if any of you saw the sunrise this morning. It was fantastic. It was, well, I should say, students, well, whether or not you did see the sunrise this morning, it's been an absolutely fabulous morning here in Glasgow. You've seen Glasgow at its best, but inevitably in something like Glasgow, once you've had a fantastic morning, the sleet, the rain, the snow and everything, that's all scheduled for later on. So that's part of the welcome to Scotland and particularly welcome to Glasgow. But that sense of something fantastic followed by something maybe not so good may be a theme around the Paris negotiations. Not so sure. That's for you to judge once you've heard this morning. I think one of the other themes that's come through much of the discussions and the commentaries about the Paris negotiations has been is it a jug half full or a jug half empty? Is it a very optimistic and positive impression, or is it perhaps the negative, well, not so sure about this and where's the detail and everything else? So, but that sense, and many of you who are from Scotland or have the great benefit of living and working in Scotland at the moment, one of the great themes of Scottish life is what's been called the duality, or the great Scottish poet Hugh MacDiarmid called the Caledonian antisysgysy, which I probably mispronounced, but everybody else does too, which is best known in the sense of, well, the great story about Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, this sense of good and bad, that duality. It's both about Glasgow's weather, Scotland's weather, but also about a theme about where we are. And I'm not going to read you any of MacDiarmid's poetry, which is far too complicated for me, but there's a great poem which sums up this sense of good and bad, which I thought I'd read to you just before we get started on climate change. And if any of you have been to a climate change law conference before and started with poetry, I'd be delighted to welcome you. But this is a poem by a great Scot, sadly left us now, called Allister Reed, and it's very simply, it's called Scotland. It was a day peculiar to this piece of the planet, when larks rose on long thin strings of singing, and the air shifted with the shimmer of actual angels. Greenness entered the body, The grasses shivered with presences, and sunlight stayed like a halo on hair and heather and hills. Walking into town, I saw, in a radiant raincoat, the woman from the fish shop. "What a day it is!" cried I, like a sunstruck madman. And what did she have to say for it? Her brow grew bleak, her ancestors raged in their graves as she spoke with all their ancient misery. "We'll pay for it, we'll pay for it, we'll pay for it." So that's partly about Scotland, but partly it's also about the more serious matter of the Paris negotiations. Now, again, back to the theme of jug half full and jug half empty, there was something quite striking came out of Paris, which was a quite extraordinary sense of positivity. And I don't think I've seen anyone that would deny that the Paris Agreement was quite an extraordinary diplomatic triumph. It was everything that the Copenhagen Agreement, so apologies to anyone from Denmark here, everything the Copenhagen Agreement wasn't. So very much a diplomatic triumph. It was a triumph for French diplomacy, I think, a triumph for the United Nations, for joint working between the United States and China in particular, and an extraordinary achievement in terms of bringing together a very wide range of international players, over 190 countries, drawing them into an international framework to take forward a climate change agreement. So it was an extraordinary achievement. But inevitably, in terms of the detail, and the phrase, "the devil is always in the detail." And what we're going to try and do today is unpack what actually happened, some of the issues that came out of the Paris Agreement. And there is a quite clear sense that some people have said, well, it was a diplomatic triumph, but where's the detail? There's a variety of commitments to enhance finance, to bring forward particular initiatives at country level, but how far, by how much, and by when? So that balance of the good and the bad, I think, is coming through quite strongly. One of the things that I've been very struck by is, and I'm sure our speakers will go into the detail of, is that the text has been quite clear around, particularly on the issue of addressing climate change, the commitment to hold the increase in the global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. It's an extraordinary commitment to make and for all the countries to come together to agree. But the detail, what does well below 2 degrees mean? By when? By how? Likewise, we're moving very strongly over the last few years away from a top-down negotiated quota or target setting for individual countries to a much more bottom-up set of contributions, in the jargon, the intended nationally determined contributions. I don't know who made up the name, but it's a quite extraordinary shift in the overall approach to climate change from what we have been seeing and what was discussed pre-Copenhagen. But the challenge that we need to look at is, well, how ambitious will the INDCs be when they come forward? How equitable will they be across the world? And how transparent and verifiable will they be? And these are precisely the issues that I think our speakers are going to go into. And just to pick up one other point is that the whole issue of finance, the main focus here today is on the legal framework, but inevitably the very central and major issue is how can that legal framework mobilize the levels of investment that are undoubtedly required to have any chance of achieving the ambitious commitments entered into about reducing climate change to below 2 degrees. Professor Nicholas Stern has estimated that will involve over the next 15 years of the order of $90 trillion of investment in infrastructure. Now, people talk big numbers. You very rarely hear bigger numbers than $90 trillion. I'm not sure if many of us can actually really get a sense of what that would actually mean. But just as as an indication, $90 trillion of investment over the next 15 years in infrastructure is significantly more than the total value of all infrastructure already in place in the world. So it's basically rebuilding the world's infrastructure and more over the next 15 years. Now, these are extraordinary commitments to be taken forward alongside the wider range and very much in parallel with some of the wider challenges we face across the world in terms of addressing poverty, in terms of managing the challenge of inclusive growth, both across the world and maybe also within Western economies, the whole renewed focus on inequality. So addressing all of these issues together, while at the same time recognizing some of the challenges that the world economy is facing at the moment in terms of uncertain and low levels of productivity growth, continuing concerns about the strength of the banks, who of course in banks would have to mobilize much of the investment that would have to take place to achieve many of these targets. So to some extent, that's an extraordinarily complicated picture and a deeply challenging one. But perhaps the two things that I'd want to draw out, an optimistic and a jug of half full message to get us started, is firstly, however difficult those challenges will be, the Paris Agreement has undoubtedly set us on a much better course than people were expecting, and have given at least the possibility and the opportunity that many of these challenges can be tackled within the basis of a coherent legal framework, which would frame, think about the word framework, it would frame the overall work, whether it's on finance, engineering, technology, and community development. So there is a very optimistic message alongside the message about how challenging this will be. But there's also a positive message that I must get across to, I wouldn't want to say we've got half and half in the audience here, but for the experts in the room, delighted you're here to share your knowledge, help us develop our understanding of what actually happened in Paris and what that will mean going forward. I can't think of a better and more important area of policy and implementation to be involved in with this. But also a small plug for the students and for prospective students, particularly of Francesco's Master in Laws course, which I just want to throw in a plug for. I likewise can't think of a more valuable career choice, a more challenging and important career choice to be involved in. And some people raise their eyebrows when you talk about careers, but this is a career that no one would particularly doubt as one that is both worthy and crucially important. So to develop the sort of broad practitioner skills that are required to play a role in addressing climate change in whatever field or area of study you need to be involved in, we certainly hope at Strathclyde and many other higher education institutions that we can contribute to the development of the next generation of experts who will work in this particular area. So I just want to finish with a quote. It's from Jeffrey Sachs, this is a quote from the Financial Times. He said, the urgent, long overdue challenge of implementation now begins, which is perhaps not a job for diplomats, but for business leaders, engineers, financial managers, and politicians. But the key point, as he said, we now have a legal framework and a shared vision to move us irresistibly forward to that goal. So the task for the rest of the afternoon, I say, is to understand that a bit better, to go into the details. And I'm delighted to welcome our first two speakers. The first is Francesco Sindico, who I think was in Paris for the event. And he will talk us through what happened, what some of the key issues are, and provide a bit of a more detailed discussion to get us started. Then I'll invite Harro Van Asselt, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute, to take us into a bit more detail of some of the issues. And then we'll have a short break, which I'll tell you again at the time, but we're going to have a 5-minute comfort break while we shift around the seating a bit and just have a small change. And then we'll get into a panel session where we'll get a yet more detailed assessment, and at that point we'll have Q&A with our expertise before finishing with Michael Melling, who's going to give us a keynote speech at the end. And we're due to finish around about 5:30. Well, 5 o'clock, and now it's got reception afterwards. So that's my overview. So on that note, over to Francesco.